On a warm June night in 1772, a group of American colonists boarded a British warship, dragged its wounded commander onto the deck, and set the vessel on fire until it burned down to the waterline. Nobody was ever convicted, nobody was ever hanged, and historians still argue that what happened that night, 3 years before Lexington and Concord, might be the real spark that started the American Revolution. So why isn't this the story everyone knows? To understand what happened, you have to understand a ship called the Gaspee and the man who commanded her, Lieutenant William Duddingston. He wasn't sent to fight anyone, he was sent to collect taxes. Britain was drowning in war debt, and the colonies, in the eyes of London, weren't paying their share. So ships like the Gaspee patrolled the waters of Narragansett Bay in Rhode Island, stopping merchant vessels, searching their cargo, and seizing anything that looked like smuggled goods. But here's what almost nobody outside Rhode Island knew at the time. Duddingston wasn't just enforcing the law, he was, by nearly every account from local merchants, humiliating an entire colony. He fired on ships that hadn't even been ordered to stop. He confiscated livestock and produce without paying for it. He treated Rhode Island, a colony that saw itself as a proud, self-governing trading power, like a criminal outpost that needed to be tamed, and the people of Providence were furious. But fury alone doesn't sink a ship. What happened next did. On the 9th of June, 1772, a small merchant packet called the Hannah was sailing up Narragansett Bay toward Providence. Its captain, a man named Thomas Lindsay, noticed the Gaspee giving chase. And this is where the story takes its first turn, because what Lindsay did next wasn't panic, it was a decision that would change history. He knew these waters, Duddingston did not. Lindsay steered the Hannah into the shallows near a sandy point called Namquid Point, hugging the shoreline in a route only a local captain would dare take. The Gaspee followed, moving fast, determined not to lose its prey. And then, suddenly, the chase ended. The Gaspee ran hard aground, its hull wedged into the sand, completely stuck, with the tide already beginning to fall. Lindsay didn't stop. He sailed on to Providence, and what he carried with him wasn't just relief, it was information. The most hated ship on the bay was stranded, helpless, and would stay that way until the tide rose again after midnight. Word spread through Providence like fire through dry grass, and in the home of a wealthy, influential merchant named John Brown, a plan began to take shape. This wasn't going to be a protest, this wasn't going to be a petition sent politely to London. Brown began gathering boats and men, and by nightfall, 8 longboats filled with more than 50 colonists were rowing out into the darkness of Narragansett Bay. Their leader was a ship captain named Abraham Whipple, a man who would later go on to fight in the Revolutionary War itself. But that night, he was leading something far more dangerous than a normal raid. He was leading an armed assault on a vessel of the King's Royal Navy. And make no mistake, in the eyes of the British Crown, that wasn't rebellion. That was treason. The punishment for treason wasn't prison, it was death. Around midnight, the boats approached the stranded Gaspee in near total darkness. A sentry on deck spotted movement on the water and called out a challenge. There was no answer, only the sound of oars. Lieutenant Duddingston rushed onto the deck, and here the tension breaks into violence. He ordered the approaching boats to stand off. They didn't, and in the chaos that followed, a shot rang out, and Duddingston went down, struck in the arm and the groin, bleeding heavily on the deck of his own ship. For a moment, everything hung in the balance. A wounded British naval officer, dozens of armed colonists swarming aboard, and a decision that could not be undone. Did they finish what they started? Did they retreat before this became something no one could take back? They didn't retreat. The colonists boarded the Gaspee, overpowered the remaining crew, and pulled Duddingston, still bleeding, onto the deck. And here is something rarely mentioned in the shorter versions of this story. They didn't leave him to die. Accounts describe the raiders binding his wounds, and later that night rowing him ashore to receive medical treatment. This wasn't mindless mob violence. It was calculated, disciplined, almost eerily controlled for a group committing what amounted to an act of war. Once the crew was removed and placed safely ashore, the raiders turned back to the ship, and what they did next was the point of no return. They set the Gaspee on fire. Flames climbed the rigging in the darkness over Narragansett Bay, visible for miles, a burning symbol of British authority collapsing into the water. By morning, the ship that had terrorized local trade for months was nothing but a smoldering, blackened hull, and somewhere in Providence, more than 50 men who had just attacked a British warship went home, changed clothes, and said nothing. Because now came the part of the story that should terrify them. Britain wanted names. King George's government was outraged, and rightly alarmed. This wasn't smuggling. This wasn't a tax protest. This was an armed assault on a Royal Navy vessel, and its commanding officer had nearly been killed. London established a special Royal Commission of Inquiry with the power to identify the attackers and send them to England to stand trial, not in a colonial court, but under English law, where conviction likely meant execution. This detail alone should have ended in disaster for the colonists, and this is where the story reveals something almost unbelievable. Despite a massive investigation, despite interviews, despite a substantial reward offered for information, not a single person in Providence talked. Not one name was ever confirmed. Not one person was ever arrested. In a town where everyone almost certainly knew who had been on those boats, the silence was absolute. Why? Because the raid on the Gaspee wasn't the isolated act of a violent mob. It had the quiet support of Rhode Island's merchant elite, men like John Brown, whose business interests had been strangled by British patrols, and who had far more to lose from cooperating with London than from staying silent. The commission eventually gave up. No one was ever punished for burning the Gaspee. And here's the piece of this story that connects it to everything that came after. The colonies watched what happened. They watched an armed attack on a British warship go completely unpunished. And they watched London's attempt to try American colonists in England without a jury of their peers. That threat, more than the burning ship itself, terrified colonial leaders across the continent. If Britain could seize Rhode Islanders and ship them overseas for trial, no colonist anywhere was safe from the same fate. In response, Virginia's House of Burgesses, led by men like Thomas Jefferson and Patrick Henry, took an extraordinary step. They called for the creation of committees of correspondence, formal networks between colonies to share information and coordinate resistance to British actions. Those committees became the communication backbone of the growing rebellion. They were the wiring that would eventually connect 13 separate colonies into a single unified movement against the Crown. 3 years before a single shot was fired at Lexington, before the Boston Tea Party had even happened, the burning of the Gaspee had already planted the mechanism that would unite the colonies in revolution. So why does almost nobody know this story? Maybe because it doesn't fit neatly into the narrative most people already know. Tea in a harbor, a lantern in a church tower, a ride through the night? Maybe because no one died, and the men responsible were never named, tried, or hanged, so there was no martyr, no trial, no singular hero for history to attach itself to. But perhaps that's exactly what makes the Gaspee Affair so remarkable. A wounded officer left to bleed on his own deck, a ship burned to ash in the dark, 50 armed men who broke the law, defied an empire, and then simply walked back into ordinary life, protected not by soldiers, but by the silence of an entire town. The Gaspee never fired another shot, it never sailed again. But in the fire that consumed it on that June night, in 1772, something else was lit. Quietly, almost invisibly, a fuse that would keep burning until it reached Philadelphia 4 years later, where 56 men would sign their names to a declaration that Britain could no longer control the American colonies at all.